one of the questions I've received a lot from folks who've been training in one of these kind of facilitator trainings or who've started facilitating is, how do you facilitate the open-ended discussion at the end of the practice, what I've called the debrief, or I think another name for this would be reflection phase. We've got the setup, the practice, and then the reflection after the practice is done, reflecting on how it went. And I think in some ways this is the most open and formless part of the facilitation process. The setup is pretty clear. Like there's these certain things that we want to mention, mention the instructions. We want to demonstrate the practice, mention the safety release valve if that's applicable, and to, invite people into the witness role and to make sure people have all their questions answered about the practice and how to do it before we actually jump in. And then the practice itself is just doing the practice. We're actually just trying to do it, which, can be challenging or can be joyful. It can be all kinds of things. But in a way, we're just doing it. Now, in the discussion, we come back after the practice and are essentially asking people, inviting people to share how it went. I think that's the essence for me of the reflection. You do something and then you reflect back on how it went. And that reflection, that looking back and considering, is part to me of the learning process. I remember encountering the work of a meditation teacher in California named Jason Siff called Unlearning Meditation. And Jason, like myself, had trained for quite a long time in the Mahasi Sayadaw tradition of Burma, the noting practice, which we've been doing for the last several weeks out loud, in this case, the internal silent version. And at a certain point, he found that the practice wasn't working for him, or just something was off, and he had to find a new way to practice, a new way to learn. And so he broke outside of that tradition, and part of what he ended up developing, to me, is kind of almost a response to it, a reaction to it, perhaps, but a response for sure. And that was to instead teach meditation like this, to say, okay, we're going to come in practice or sit, and there's no instructions. So no one's going to tell you what to do in this. And then after it's over, though, we're going to reflect on how it went. And if that's a personal practice, you'd actually journal, do a kind of meditative reflection, just reflecting back on what happened and writing anything you want around that. And the idea is that you don't necessarily have to know what you're doing ahead of time or have a plan or a technique, so long as you're actually taking the time to consider the impact and significance of what just went down. That part of the learning process is really not just about trying to follow instructions, but it's about reflecting back on how things went and learning from it. And in this case, we learn together in the social reflection. So it's a little more open-ended. And because of that, I think it can be helpful to, in a way, think about some of the different options that we have as facilitators, in that open-ended space of, hey, how did it go? Anyone want to share any reflections on how the practice went, or ask any questions that came up? For me, there's at least 6 different tactics that I consciously am aware that I use. There's probably other ones I have no idea. And there are many more beyond what I know. So this isn't meant to be an exhaustive list. It's just meant to kind of be a starting point. And so I'll go through each of these. I'll just list them out first. The first is listening. The second is mirroring. The third is affirming. The fourth tactic you could use is clarifying. The fifth is polling. And the sixth is silence. Okay, so let me go through each of these just briefly and just touch on what I think I mean by each of these. And then we'll see what comes. So the first tactic, if someone is sharing, and this is what often happens, we open it up and someone will share. One option we have in response to that is we can just listen. And at the end, we can just say thank you. It doesn't have to be complicated. If that's all you do, I'd say oftentimes that is actually enough, because the practice itself brings up so much for people oftentimes that in a way it's just giving people space and letting them go. And sometimes it's enough to just listen and say thank you. That's one of my favorite tactics. Sometimes it's not even a tactic, it's just, that's what I do, just listening. Thank you. Another thing you can do as a facilitator is you can try to mirror back what someone has said. This is mirroring. So if someone shares something, you can just reflect back what you heard, not trying to add anything to it, just your understanding of what you heard back to them. And in a way, this is, one, it actually demonstrates that you're listening, which is, I think, helpful as a facilitator for people to get you're present and hearing what's going on. I think it creates more of a sense of group cohesion and trust. But also it gives people, more importantly, it gives people an opportunity to hear what they've just shared coming back to them in a new way. So it gives them opportunity to reflect on what they just shared, reflect on their reflection. So it presents an opportunity for a kind of meta reflection, META reflection. Oh, is that what I said? Oh, that's interesting. Sometimes we hear what we just said back to us and we're like, oh, wow, that sounds really profound. Did I say that? Yeah, actually. Sometimes we do say profound things and have deep insight, right? And oftentimes we don't even maybe recognize that. So it's really cool to hear things reflected back. At other times, we may actually want to build on or share something in response to what someone said. And this next tactic, which I'll call affirming, is just to start by first affirming what someone said. Affirm the wisdom in what the previous person said. Maybe there's something you think they're missing. Maybe there's something you feel like needs to be added. But instead of just going right into what's missing, what needs to be added, which can signal that that person was wrong or that they were off in some way, we can first affirm, to say, whatever it was about what they shared that to us was, that we appreciate and agree with or see is true ourselves. And then we can add something, additional, just kind of build on what they were saying, rather than try to kind of get into a kind of contentious relationship with the sharing. So I'd call that the affirming tactic. Another thing you could do is you can clarify, because oftentimes people will say stuff and we'll have no idea what they're talking about, or we might just be a little unclear about some part of it. And I know that there is a very real tendency to not want to ask clarifying questions at times when we're in a role like a facilitator, certainly in a teaching role or a guiding role or mentoring role, some role where we're supposed to know what we're doing, to ask questions, because it kind of goes against sometimes it goes against our ideas about what it means to be in those roles. And here I think it can be so helpful just to ask a clarifying question. If there's something I'm not clear on, it's often the case that other people aren't either. And so by asking a question to clarify, like, oh, what did you mean by that exactly? Could you say a bit more about that? Then it gives an opportunity for everyone who is confused to learn more. And it also, and I think this is really important, it gives the person who shared an opportunity to get a little bit deeper into what they're saying. Because sometimes people will share stuff, right? And it's like half formulated. It's not a complete, it hasn't cohered in their experience. And that's the reason it's confusing. But if we can kind of aid them and support them in getting a little bit clearer on the points that we felt were confused, which might mean that they were also confused, then it gives them an opportunity, I think, often to clarify that themselves. So this is the clarifying tactic. The next tactic that I often would use, and I learned this one from Diane Musho Hamilton, a Zen teacher who I think I've mentioned here, but she is one of the most skilled facilitators that I've seen in terms of her capacity to facilitate group processes and social practices. And Arthur C. Clarke's quote comes to mind, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I'd say the same is true of any sufficiently advanced facilitation or teaching. It appears as magic. But here, in a way, what we're doing is trying to, point out all the different tricks, right, that the magicians use. And certainly the case, I think, that the magic comes from more than just tactics and tricks, but good facilitators do both. And Diane, one of the things that she would often do is when people in groups would be sharing with her something about their experience and how the practice went or how it was like, especially if and when this is common when someone might make a comment that isn't just about their experience. They might kind of go further than that and make a kind of comment about everyone's experience or about someone else's experience, which may or may not be true, of course. Like, it could be actually true. But what I've found is that I don't know if it's true. So it's a great idea to poll, to say, okay, let's see, was that true for anyone else? If you could raise your hand, if that was true for you. Okay, and then you'll see people raise their hand. And then you could say, okay, for whom wasn't that true? And then people raise their hand. Okay, and then you can sort of see, sometimes everyone raises their hand and you're like, oh, wow, there is clear, coherent agreement among the group. And by asking that question, I've highlighted the sameness or the agreement that's present, which before we didn't know, right? So we're kind of surfacing information about people's perspectives. If you see, people raise their hand on one thing, they say, oh yeah, that was my experience too. And then someone's like, no, mine was like totally different. It was the opposite or something. Then we see there's divergence. We see there's difference in the space. So this is a tactic for exploring the degree of sameness and difference that's present among the group. And one thing that can be quite skillful in doing the polling method is when there are divergent perspectives, you can intentionally call on those who had a different experience. You can invite them to say something about their experience so that you make space for the full range of experience that was happening, instead of getting into this kind of interesting groupthink, which almost always, I think, happens with human beings when we get together and start talking, where when there's a certain kind of momentum in the group, people will either jump on that, or they'll feel like, oh, that's not true for me, so I'm just going to stay quiet and not say anything and just kind of shut down. So we make room for the voices and the experiences that are kind of, in some sense, marginalized in the discussion. And oftentimes that, in my experience, brings an incredible amount of dynamism and energy into the conversation. The beautiful thing about sameness and coherency is the unification of it, the sense of safety and ease and relaxation that comes from everyone being in agreement and having a similar kind of experience. But you take that too far, right? It becomes its own kind of prison. And actually, the energy of sameness is like energy that goes down. So often Diane would point out in her facilitator trainings that when the energy, and you can sort of sense the energy in a group or in a room, and when it's really low, that is an indication that there needs to be a little bit of difference that's pointed out or brought up to energize things, to bring it back into balance. Sometimes, though, it goes too far, it's restless, and everyone's talking and no one will stop, so we can do the next thing, things like that. I'm sure you've been in groups where that's true, right? And there it's helpful to kind of come back into coherency and focus on sameness. So this polling method is a nice way to just kind of almost get like a quick snapshot at what's happening in the group, and then be able to use that information to kind of steer the energetic dimensions of the exchange. Again, this is a pretty, in some ways this is advanced practice, but it's for me it's a really great tactic for exploring the sameness and difference, polling. And then the last one I wanted to mention is silence. Here in this training, we often, in many of the forms, we're using silence. For instance, in the beginning of the sessions together, we do a quick check-in. And you might have noticed that I don't typically say anything in response to people's check-ins. There's this sort of implicit, although it was never made explicit, but there's an implicit understanding that we're just listening to each other check in, and then the next person checks in. And that silence creates a kind of space which can be useful when, I'd say, there isn't something else that we should be doing that's not more useful, like asking a clarifying question or sharing something. Sometimes silence is actually a negation of our responsibility as a facilitator, because we might have a sense that something's needed, but we might be scared and we might just not say anything. That's not the kind of silence I mean. It's the kind of silence of, I'm just going to let this be and just see what happens. It doesn't feel like there's anything I need to do or say in response to this. It's enough. It's sufficient in itself. Sometimes we do say thank you, and that's fine. That's just listening and saying thank you. But here, just being silent itself can be a really interesting option. So these are, again, just some tactics that I think can be helpful to try out. And like every practice, trying something out for the first time feels a little awkward, or can, and maybe even feels awkward for a while until it becomes second nature. And so I would just kind of offer that if any of these tactics are useful and you want to give it a try, and it seems like maybe there's some promising results, add it, see what happens if you add it to your repertoire. And see if you can bring it into other things. This is the cool thing about facilitating social meditation, is it's not different in a certain way than facilitating anything. Any kind of group process is similar in the sense that we're tuning into other people, we're being aware of ourselves. In social meditation, we're actually explicitly training in that capacity to be aware of ourselves and others. And we're using the information that's coming from that kind of both and mindfulness, that both and awareness, to help, in some sense, nudge the conversation toward wisdom, toward compassion, toward opening. And of course, we sometimes fail stupendously at that, and that's part of it too. As kind of, again, reflecting on how it went. I think there's something useful about reflecting on our facilitation and thinking about, okay, well, how could I do things differently next time? What could I try? How did that go? All of that is just part of the natural learning process. But again, I hope this is useful for you in facilitating this practice or any other practice.